Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be taking a look at producing a wet setup. We're not actually going to do any of the testing here, just in the BMW M6 GT3. And like the previous episodes with the setup tuning, we're going to load up the stable setup and then we're going to go through the various different aspects here on the setup and tuning screens, talk through them as to what you can do to basically lean the car more towards a good wet weather setup. We're not going to actually go through what the various aspects actually do because we've done that and covered that in previous episodes. We're more just going to talk about what direction you want to be going with these various settings to try and get two types of wet weather setups. Which one you pick is kind of entirely up to you and what you feel happier driving with. So the first type of wet weather setup is obviously the safer option. You're trying to basically maximize the amount of grip and stability in the wet conditions. Generally with that, what you have is a more understeery car. It's a lot more predictable, you know what it's going to do. You kind of have a lot more downforce. It's probably going to be a little bit slower certainly on the straights, but the car is going to be safer and you're going to be aiming to keep the car on the black stuff. The other option is basically going for more speed in the wet conditions. With that, you're going to have a tiny little bit of oversteer coming into the corners, not so it's breaking away from you, but you're having that nice rotation in, and then obviously you want a good stable car for the apex, and then also actually applying the power coming out the exit of the turn. So with that, you probably go a little bit looser on the rear than you would with a basically the safer setup. But we'll go through and talk through all the various options here and what kind of things you're going to be doing and adjusting in order to get yourself the best wet setup possible. Now obviously we're going to start off with the tyre compounds, and the first thing that you should be making sure that you're doing is actually having the wet tyre on the car when you're in the wet conditions. If you have the automatic by weather option selected here, it should automatically apply the wet tyre to the car whenever the conditions are wet, but also it is generally a good idea to go ahead and actually select the wet tyre itself as well, just to make doubly sure. There is no intermediate tyre in pretty much any of the race cars in the game. Some of the road cars and also the track cars, obviously they have various different types of tyres that range from basically like a full-on wet all the way through to a summer tyre, maybe a full-on slick, and those basically a range of tyres will have various different amounts of grooves, and some of them may more resemble an intermediate tyre, maybe usable in light rain conditions, kind of in between basically it being dry and it being full-on wet. But generally what you will want to be doing is obviously making sure that you're on the wet tyre and making sure that you have the maximum grip that you could possibly get, because you don't get all that much grip from a dry or slick type tyre when the track is wet. Tyre pressures. Your target tyre pressure is pretty much going to be the same as what it is in the dry. Generally what it might be beneficial to do is go possibly about 0.02 to 0.05 bar lower than what you would usually aim for in the dry, just to try and increase the contact patch between the surface of the tyre and the actual surface of the circuit itself. It'll give yourself a little bit more grip and yeah, make the car a little bit more stable. I'll provide down in the link below I'll provide a link down below in the description to Casey's post on the official forums, again showing the target tyre pressures of what you should be aiming for. But generally for the wet tyres, they're going to be pretty much the same as the dry tyres for the tyre type you're on. Tyre type being like the GT tyre or the prototype tyre or open wheel tyre or touring car tyre. So yeah, tyre pressures don't really vary all that much. Obviously make sure that you're hitting your target tyre pressure, the hot pressure, 5 to 6 laps in, and basically adjust from there. Maybe go a little bit slightly lower on the tyre pressure than what you would actually do in the dry. Now when it comes to braking, obviously you're not going to be hitting the speeds and you're not going to have the braking grip that you'll have in the dry when in the wet compared to what you would have in the dry. So with that, that means that under heavy braking, your chance of actually locking up the brakes is going to be increased. And generally to combat that, what you'll want to do is actually lower the brake pressure to basically avoid the locking under braking And obviously what you want to be doing as well is obviously braking to the point where you're just underneath the ABS level. That's where you'll get obviously your maximum braking performance. So similar technique to what you would in a dry, maybe slightly softer than that. Obviously not all cars will have ABS to lean on if you do start to lock up. So obviously the main thing that you want to be doing is making sure that you avoid locking up under braking, as that's just basically going to understeer the car in a straight line straight off the circuit on the other side, and you're not going to be able to make the corner. So reduce the brake pressure, and that will help with the basically combating the locking and making sure that you're getting the braking performance that you need and getting the car slowed down. When it comes to the brake balance, this is where personal preference sort of thing comes in, and you start to kind of lean more towards whether you want that the safer setup or the faster setup. If you're looking for safe, have the brake balance further forward, go more understeery, so something like a 60-40 is a good value with that. If you're looking for something that is going to give you a little bit more rotation coming into the corner, then obviously you want to move the brake bias slightly more rearwards. Don't move it so far back that the rear tyres are actually going to lock up and you're basically going to lose all grip there, and the car's going to over rotate when you come off the brakes and turn into the corner. But having that brake balance slightly more rearwards may give you a little bit more rotation, so do it in moderation. Basically what you want to be doing is obviously being stable and reasonably safe, but it's not full on understeering, you're just waiting for the car to turn in. So it's again kind of personal preference. I tend to stick, I generally run 58-42 in the dry. I generally may go down to a 57-43 in the wet. It entirely depends on the actual circuit and basically the conditions and the confidence that I have in the car at the time. Now obviously where your brake pressure is actually going to be lower, you're not going to be putting as much friction through the brake pads and the brake discs. You're not going to be generating as much heat as you would in the dry with that lower brake pressure, so you can afford to close up the brake duct openings, and you can do this quite considerably. Obviously it entirely depends on the actual circuit itself, the conditions as to how much rain there is that's falling, the ambient temperatures. But what you want to be doing is just like the dry, again, keep the brakes in their optimal ranges. It's 300 to 600, maybe 650 degrees on the steel brakes, that is degrees centigrade, and then, or degrees Celsius. And then when it comes to the carbon ceramic brakes, you should be looking for a minimum of 600 and then up to about 1200. So those are the kind of ranges that you should be aiming for with those two brake types. And with that, obviously, adjust the brake duct openings accordingly, close them up. You should be able to close up the rear brake duct a fair bit more than the front, and generally you can run them lower than you can in the dry. That'll help to maintain the heat in the brakes, but also actually help increase the straight line speed as well, as they'll be producing less drag. Coming on to the downforce, now this is obviously going to very much depend on basically the setup type that you're looking for when it comes to the wet, but it's also going to be very much affected by the actual circuit layout. So the low downforce tracks such as Le Mans, Red Bull Ring, Monza, generally is probably a pretty good idea to maybe go very, very similar to what you would in the dry conditions, maybe a little bit more rear wing by a click or two than you would in the dry conditions for the wet conditions, as aero isn't really as effective in the wet as it is in the dry. Obviously you've got water running over all the various aero parts, you're therefore not getting as much airflow and aero efficiency flowing over those parts, so you're not going to get the aerodynamic grip that in the wet conditions that you would in the dry. Also you obviously are not going to get up to the same sort of speeds. Obviously with the high downforce cars, they will still be able to provide a fair amount of aero grip, and it could be beneficial, especially on some of the tracks where there's more medium to high speed corners, going and trying to keep that a lot of downforce on there. Obviously the safer option is to put more downforce on as well, but like I said, it actually depends on the track and what kind of setup it is that you're actually aiming for. A lot of people tend to basically go with maximum downforce in the wet to basically try and compensate for the aero loss, but with that you're obviously increasing the amount of drag that you'll be producing in a straight line. So find that balance for the actual circuit that you're on. Like I said, low downforce circuits, it may be beneficial to actually keep quite a bit of the aero off if you can, and just basically running with a slightly higher rear wing. That'll give you better straight line speed, and obviously yeah, find that balance for the aerodynamics as well. Obviously don't go too heavy with the aero on the front and then no aero on the rear, as that's just going to produce a lot of oversteer. Likewise, if you go and take some aero off the front of the car and go with a lot of aero on the rear of the car, you're going to have a more safer and more understeery setup as well. So find that balance that works for you for the circuit that you are actually driving on. With the weight bias, generally what I tend to do in the wet is basically just put it as far rearwards as it goes. Obviously with the M6 GT3 car, the engine's in the front, there isn't all that much weight in the rear of the car, so putting the rear weight bias backwards is going to help with the traction and acceleration coming out of corners. Obviously mid-engine and rear-engine cars have that advantage straight away, so the Porsche 911 GT3, they are very, very good in wet conditions, as they are very good at applying the traction coming out of corners. They have a lot of grip on the rear tyres. So be mindful of that as to where you basically want to go with the weight bias, whether you want to put more weight on the rear or whether you want to move it slightly forward a little bit. But generally, going with the weight more towards the rear is generally better. Now, coming on to the suspension, caster angle I don't really ever touch all that much. But basically, as a quick recap as to what it does, going with a lower caster angle is basically going to reduce the steering effort and is going to make the car more responsive and improve the turn-in. Having a higher caster angle is going to make the car feel heavier. The car generally feels quite heavy anyway in the wet conditions, so it may be beneficial in some places to go with a slightly higher caster angle, just to basically try and improve the stability of the car and make sure that it's not turning in too much or more than you want it to. When it comes to the camber angles, you're not going to be producing the same amount of G-force as you would in the dry. Therefore, you're not going to have as much cornering grip, and generally what it's going to be better to do is decrease the camber angles from what you would usually run in the dry. Try and maximize that contact patch between the surface of the tyre and also the track when going through the corners. Obviously make sure that you're using the telemetry HUD view and keeping a close eye on the basically the thirds across the width of the tyre in terms of the tyre temperatures, basically monitoring those to see if you're getting the right sort of camber angles that you are aiming for, with that 5 to 10 degrees spread across the width of the tyre. Also, actually making sure that the car actually feels good driving in those wet conditions. Going with a higher camber angle will probably give you a little bit more grip going through the corner, but once you actually start to slide and lose that traction, the car's going to break away much quicker. Going with a lower camber angle, the slides when you do start to break away is going to be much more progressive and easier to basically catch, but at the same time you're not going to have as much cornering grip. So find that balance for the circuit that you're driving on. Obviously having lower camber angles is also going to improve your braking performance, as there'll be that bigger contact patch. And then also coming out of the corners when accelerating in a straight line, you're going to have better traction as well. So it does kind of very much depend on the actual makeup of the circuit as to which way you want to go with your camber angles, but generally you will want to drop them a little bit from what you would usually run in the dry, probably half a degree, so 0.5 degrees, somewhere in and around that region is generally what I tend to go, a little bit lower than what I would in the dry conditions, maybe a little bit more depending on the actual circuit itself and what you're getting in terms of temperature from the actual tyres. Now when it comes to ride height, generally there is something that I've recently learned with ride height, which I'll probably have to talk about in another future episode. But generally, having a little bit more rake is obviously going to increase your aerodynamic drag. It's going to put more downforce on the rear of the car as well. But you don't want to increase the rake so much in the sense that basically the rear of the car is too high and it's too soft and loose and it's kind of all over the place. So Obviously find the right kind of ride height balance for what you're after. Obviously make sure that you're not grounding out on the car, especially if you're putting more downforce on, so you may need to raise the ride height a little bit in order to basically minimize that. Obviously you can also use bump stops to try and reduce the amount of grounding out on the surface of the track going down at high speeds. So find that ride height balance for you. I don't really, there's not really too much I could say other than what I have said about ride heights previously in the previous suspension episode, and also what I will have to cover in a future episode and a separate topic to this, talking specifically about ride height and aerodynamics. Now coming on to spring rates, we'll also actually talk about the anti-roll bars here as well at the same time, because they're kind of under the same sort of umbrella here. But essentially, generally what you go for is lean more towards mechanical grip, so going softer with the anti-roll bars and also the spring rates. Don't go too soft though, that basically the car doesn't feel supported, especially on the rear. But you're not going to get the aerodynamic grip that you would do in the dry, so that's not overly important, and it's better to go with the safer option here and go with the softer springs to improve that mechanical grip, especially in those slower corners. Obviously if you're driving a high downforce car, then obviously you'll need to leave some of the basically the stiffness from the springs and the anti-roll bars in order to make sure that the aerodynamics actually work, as generally you're not going to get that get the same benefit from mechanical grip as you probably would trying to keep more aero on. So it depends on the actual car is that you're driving, but with like the GT3 cars for example, it's generally better to go softer, try and get that more mechanical grip, and it'll be safer in that sense as well, especially on the rear of the car. Now when it comes to steering ratio, this is kind of very much personal preference. Obviously lowering the steering ratio will make the steering feel a lot lighter and a lot quicker. Going with a higher value, say 15.0 or 16.0 or even 17, that's basically going to increase the amount of steering effort, so the wheel's going to feel heavier, but you can also be more precise with it as well. So you may want to increase the steering ratio a tiny bit for the wet conditions. It's entirely up to you. It's personal preference sort of thing. Some people run quite low steering ratio values. I generally, with the M6, I've kind of been keeping them at default anyway, so I don't really touch it all that much, only very, very slightly depending on the actual circuit and the stuff that I covered back in the suspension episode when talking about the steering ratio specifically. So it's up to you where you want to go with the steering ratio. Toe in angles on both the front and rear. Obviously going with more of an angle, either positive or negative, is going to increase the friction and the rolling resistance going down the straights, and with that you're obviously going to see a greater effect of either more turning or more straight line stability, but also you're going to help to maintain or keep some of the tyre temperature in the car as well with those greater angles as you're getting more friction. So with the toe in angle, you may want to actually increase the angles a little bit more, whether that's a more negative toe-in angle or a more positive toe-in angle. Basically, yeah, it depends on the circuit as to what it is that you're actually aiming for, whether you want more straight line stability or whether you're looking for a little bit more turn-in power and basically better cornering response. Anti-roll bar we talked about. Third spring, it's pretty much the same sort of thing with the spring rates. We talked about how it covered how it worked in the suspension episode, but again, mechanical grip is probably going to be your friend in the wet conditions. Coming on to the dampers, bump stops you can basically do is exactly the same as you would do in the dry. It's entirely up to you here whether you take them all out and prefer the handling of the car that way, or you can leave them in and obviously try and help avoid the bottoming out onto the surface of the track on the more bumpier circuits. So entirely depends. It's basically bump stops a free game, and you could do what you want, fairly similar to what you do in the dry when it comes to the wet conditions. With the dampers though, what you'll want to do is obviously make sure that you're adjusting the dampers to match these suspension settings that you are basically using I'll again, down in the description below, provide a link to UC's suspension calculator, and you can use that to adjust the dampers. I'll probably need to do an episode on the suspension calculator actually, and how to actually use it, as I've had a few people in the comments asking basically how to use it. Although UC does provide a very good description in the first post in the link that I'll provide, it can be a little bit daunting at first when first basically loading up the suspension calculator and fiddling around with it, but follow UC's instructions as best you can and have a little fiddle and play around with the various damper values. Obviously, make sure that you're reading the help text and go back to the dampers episode as well to basically look at how you can adjust the dampers a little bit further within their ranges in order to try and find a good critical value, but also actually find the handling of the car over the bumps and the response to your own driver inputs. Basically, try and provide a nice, good, stable car in that sense. So coming on to the ECU engine and gearing. Obviously, fuel load, you'll want basically you just want the fuel to last the length of the race or the stint, whatever it is that you're testing. You don't want any more than that. With the boost pressure, again, it's not something you really touch for the wet. You can decrease it a little bit if you kind of want to avoid the boost kicking in quite aggressively. It entirely depends on the actual car itself, but generally, keeping it at 100% with the modern day cars, you'll be fine. Again, it's just that tiny little bit of engine wear that you'll get naturally, and but basically the added benefit of running 100% boost pressure in the modern cars is going to outweigh basically taking boost pressure off, because obviously it's going to affect top end speed. You just need to be a little bit lighter with your throttle inputs. When it actually comes to the older cars, such as the Lotus 98T and stuff like that, obviously in race conditions, depending on the length of the race, it will be beneficial to take some boost pressure off, because obviously you'll increase the amount of engine wear and engine damage from having that higher boost pressure. Covered this in the ECU engine and gearing episode. But yeah, boost pressure isn't something that you'll generally touch when it comes to the wet conditions. Likewise with air restrictor, just leave it at maximum, don't need to touch it. Radiator opening, you could probably close up, similar to the brake duct openings. You could probably close this up, obviously running where the conditions are generally cooler in wet conditions. You can afford to close a radiator opening up, but obviously make sure that you are still keeping it open in order to have enough airflow going into the engine to ensure that it doesn't overheat. Engine braking. So again, this is like I covered in the ECU engine and gearing episode as to what the engine braking actually does. Obviously, running with the lower value will have the engine braking much more prominent. It'll be a lot more effective, whereas having a higher value will make it a lot less prominent and have less of an effect, and make the car a lot safer. So with that, higher value if you want a more stable car upon turning and basically shifting down the lower gears. But in some ways it's nice to have a little bit of engine braking to help rotate the car. So that's where the speed comes back in. Obviously, you probably want to go a little bit safer, use a value slightly higher than you would in the drive for the circuit that you're on, because otherwise you'll probably lose too much speed and you may get a little bit too much rotation. It depends what you kind of want from the car and how you can handle it in terms of the engine braking when off throttle and turning into the corner. So yeah, this is one of those things that does help play more towards whether you want the safer setup or whether you want to lean more towards speed. With the gear ratios and everything else like that, you can't really adjust them here in the GT3 cars, but you'll need to adjust them on other cars in terms of the wet setup. Obviously, if you're in changeable conditions, then it's probably best to leave them as they were in the dry. But with the wet conditions, if you know it's going to be a full-on wet race from start to finish, you can adjust the gear ratios a little bit to try and make sure that you are basically maximizing the best that you can out of each. each gear, that you're not kind of sat in between gears going through certain corners, and then when on the longest straight you're getting up towards the top end of the rev range in the highest gear, but obviously giving yourself a little bit of headroom as well for when you are slipstreaming other cars. Now coming on to traction control, ABS strength and fuel map. Fuel map, leave it running exactly the same as you would in the dry. Traction control, obviously it's down to you here as to what it is that you actually like. Obviously running with a higher percentage will allow for more wheel slip, which will allow for you to potentially have more acceleration if you can translate the power to from the tyres to the circuit effectively and you're not getting too much wheel spin. But generally you'll have probably a slightly lower traction control slip setting than you would when compared to the dry, to basically just help manage the wheel spin when coming out the exit of corners, and basically reducing the amount of torque being delivered to the wheels, and yeah, minimizing that wheel spin. But obviously that's going to hurt your acceleration a little bit, so find that balance for you. Obviously make sure that you're not spinning out the wheels too much. Again, with the ABS strength as well, you may want to adjust this slightly so it kicks in slightly sooner if you need it to, or potentially if you're still finding that the ABS is actually kicking in too soon and you're finding, especially with the lower brake pressure, you're finding that you feel that you can brake a little bit heavier without the tyres locking, or should I say the tyres are, yeah, the ABS is not really kicking in at all. You can basically adjust the ABS strength to your own personal liking. So very much traction control and ABS strength are kind of your own personal preference sort of things as to your own driving ability, what you want, when you want those two, the ABS system and the traction control system, to actually kick in. Now differentials. Obviously we covered the differentials tab not too long ago, and here basically what you want to do is go with slightly safer settings than you would with regards to the dry. So generally, again, tend to keep the clutch LSD. The preload, generally tend to decrease the amount of preload, so the effect isn't quite as strong when you come from off throttle, on throttle to off throttle and on off throttle to on throttle. So basically go with the softer options here. Clutches as well, obviously this affects as like a multiplier for the amount of strength. It may be beneficial to run with slightly less clutches in the dry. Generally I don't really tend to adjust the differential too much, or I haven't done previously in the past when it comes to the wet weather setups. Obviously the power ramp and the coast ramp, these you'll want to adjust a fair amount. It may be beneficial to go with a slightly higher coast ramp in order to basically reduce the effect of the locking of the differential when coming off the throttle and slowing down for the corner. And then with the power ramp, obviously you want to make sure that you are getting as much traction from the tires as possible. So if you feel like if you feel one of the tires starting to slip, whether it's the inside wheel or just the outside wheel, obviously adjust the power ramp in order to basically try and reduce the slip and the distribution of torque going from the tires to be a little bit more balanced, to try and help provide with better traction coming out of the corners. But obviously it depends on the actual circuit and the layout of the track and the corners and things like that. For instance, the Parabolica coming out of the exit of Monza, having a higher power ramp there, which generally is better for traction in a straight line, isn't going to be so great because you're doing a lot of turning still whilst accelerating. So it may be more beneficial to go with a lower power ramp angle for a corner such as that. Obviously think about the entire circuit, don't necessarily think about just one corner. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you want to look at when it comes to wet weather setups, whether you're going for a safer, slightly more understeery, or whether you want to go for something that's a little bit quicker and is going to be needing a little bit more oversteer upon initial turning, but obviously having good traction for the acceleration coming out of the corners and being still predictable, or whether you kind of want the balance in between, which is both good, safe, but also has good turning, cornering ability, yet still behaves in a predictable manner. You're not having to fight the car all that much. Wet weather driving is a little bit of an art form as such. You're going to be moving the wheel around a lot more. You're going to need to be a lot more sensitive with your inputs and a lot smoother in order to basically try and maximize the performance out of the car and maintain the grip going around the circuit in the wet conditions, and obviously making sure that you are trying to avoid the larger live track puddles where you can, so having to adjust your racing line for that. But hopefully these general sort of like hints and tips have helped you guys out with what you should be doing for a wet weather setup. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. In the meantime, feel free to consider subscribing to the channel if you're enjoying this content, and if you are new to the channel and have just discovered it, obviously all the support that you guys have been giving me is very much appreciated. All the likes, the shares, the follows and everything else like that has been absolutely fantastic. Recently just got, as some of you may have seen, very good internet, finally upgraded to BT Infinity here in the UK. So hopefully in the very near future we may actually start to see a couple of live streams pop up on the YouTube channel. May try Twitch out in the future, but I'll start off with YouTube for the moment, as obviously that's where a lot of you guys reside and obviously follow me from. So yes, thank you very much for watching, guys. Hopefully very exciting things for the future, but until the next episode, have fun, take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you guys later. Ciao.